Well, I'm joined now by Omer Ozkizilcik. He's an analyst at SETA Foundation and editor of Syrian Agenda, a Turkish website monitoring the conflict. Bassam Barabandi is a former Syrian diplomat and founder of the opposition movement People Demand Change. Samuel Ramani is a researcher at Oxford University, specializing in Russian foreign policy. Matthew Brodsky is a Middle East analyst and senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. And Serhan Afajani is the coordinator of the Center of Iranian Studies based in Ankara. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. We don't usually have 5 guests on the program at the same time, so I would really appreciate it if you could keep your answers brief so we can get through more ground during the 24 minutes or so that we'll be discussing this, and everybody has an equal chance to bounce their ideas off each other. Let me start with Bassam Barabandi first. The fact that international powers, especially the Europeans, are sitting together and they're saying, we need to talk about rebuilding Syria. Is it an insult to those who are still experiencing the effects of the war while the war still rages on? Why build a factory if it will just be bombed next week?
When they say that we want to rebuild Syria, we have to understand what they are means. If they are talking about rewarding the regime for the killing, for the refugees, for destroying the Syria, then I think Russia, Iran should pay the price, not the European. If they are talking about rebuilding Syria in order to get the refugees back home, which is very valid and moral things to do, I think then we have to talk about political transitions. Most of the Syrian refugees, they would love to come back home today. The major problem, obstacle not to come back, is the regime itself. The regime didn't change its behavior. We saw this in the south, with the north, in the center of Syria. People still be tortured. There's thousands of people are disappeared or in torturing camps. So the reconstruction itself is not the solution. It's not a step forward in both ways. If someone wants to reward the regimes, it's Russia. Why the European to pay the money? If somebody wants the refugee to come back, it's not about the money, it's about safety and security. So I don't think this is yet mature time to discuss this issue in a serious way. Maybe they can use it as stakes or carrots for the regime to say, if you change, if you are willing to change, which is I doubt it, then you have some kind of rewards for the Syrian, not for the regime itself.
Omer, a lot of people, Syrians I've spoken to, said we need transitional justice at the very least first, before we can talk about rebuilding.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes, actually, it's fair, but the point here is how to achieve justice when the Assad regime thinks that he has won the war. So there's an issue that the Assad regime, with the help of Iran and Russia, has actively prevented any other party of the Syrian war from winning this war, and he has been able to stay in power. So actually, I think, secondly, about rebuilding Syria, we have also to see what's going on the ground. So the reality is, some might speak about rebuilding and reconstruction in Syria, but actually it's already happening. So the Russians, the Chinese and the Iranians are trying to gain some investment projects. They are trying to rebuild Syria. For example, the Russians even some days ago started to rebuild the train way from Aleppo to Damascus. And also Turkey and the United States of America are already investing in construction efforts. For example, Turkey is building schools, hospitals, highways in northern Aleppo, Afrin. The United States of America have accelerated funding from the Saudis and Emiratis to rebuild Raqqa. So it's already happening there, even if we don't speak about it.
So it's already happening. Matthew Brodsky, does that mean that the status quo is going to continue? Assad's going to stick around. There's no possibility of him falling anytime soon, and everybody has to be pragmatic right now?
Well, I think Secretary of State Pompeo has been fairly clear that he has a list of behavior that he wants to see changed in Assad. It's similar, in fact, to the list he issued previously about Iran's behavior. I don't think Assad's going to be able to live up to that list. And of course, there needs to be justice handed out for his war crimes. But the fact is, when it comes to then the reconstruction aspect, then there are essentially 2 Syrias. There's the regime-held area, which is, of course, Assad and Russia and Iran. And then there's where the United States is and the Syrian Democratic Forces. And the Arabs we are empowering within that coalition. And so I think making sure that money is not funneled freely into Assad and Russia's and Iran's hands is extremely important. I think that constitutes a high amount of American leverage. If we just give that up, then of course there's no pressure on Assad. So I don't see why, from an American perspective, we should be looking to part with that kind of leverage, especially when we've just recently been able to build that up.
And something that I guess annoys the Americans, Samuel Ramani, is the fact that the Russians are benefiting from this, not just politically in terms of Syria over the past 8 years, but perhaps economically when it comes to rebuilding. They signed that bilateral agreement last year, giving Russia exclusive rights to oil and gas under Syrian regime control. Do the Russians feel as if this is going to be a big bonanza for them in the long run?
I think that Russia definitely feels like it could benefit greatly from the Syrian reconstruction process. First of all, it will allow Russia to present an image of being a humanitarian stakeholder and a responsible stakeholder. So even though it's been involved in the destruction of hospitals and schools and the cover-up on the chemical weapons, by looking like it's rebuilding those houses and those facilities, it looks like, first of all, it's actually a constructive actor, which is good for its image in the Middle East. And also, Russia is probably not going to be able to invest capital itself in large quantities simply because it doesn't have the money to do that. So what it will do is it'll piggyback effectively off investments from other countries, like China, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and use its advantage on the ground. The fact that it knows the Syrian terrain, it knows the security situation, is an indispensable guarantor of security through its naval and air bases to Assad, to execute the contracts that these countries want to implement. So Russian companies will ultimately be middlemen in these transactions and take considerable cuts, particularly in the construction sector, and also in the energy sector, and in the mining area where they've gotten control over the country's phosphate reserves.
Serhan Afajan, the Iranians, as we get closer and closer to what can be deemed a political settlement, even though there isn't a political settlement, fighting still raging in Idlib and there's massive dispossession, are the Iranians noticing that other countries need them more and more when it comes to sorting out Syria?
Definitely. And they sort of feel that they have the upper hand in Syria compared, for example, to Turkey, but not Russia, definitely. And the problem is, as far as the reconstruction process is concerned, at least from the Iranian perspective, lies, I think, in two major dynamics. The first one is the definition of reconstruction. For Iran, reconstruction basically means the restoration of Assad's legitimacy in the country as the president and as the legitimate power in Damascus. And the second problem, or the second dynamic, is that who wants Bashar al-Assad to change his behavior? Iran doesn't want him to change his behavior. And Iran wants a political settlement within the scope of the existing status quo in Syria. So for the Iranians, Iran is very close to pushing its own terms as far as the reconstruction process is concerned.
And that would arguably, Bassam, if reconstruction happens according to what the Iranians want, that perpetuates the very thing that Syrians rose up against, right? Assad being in power, controlling the economy.
I will disagree. I will disagree with other colleagues who talk about that the US, Turkey, Iran has already invested in Syria. It's easy to sign a contract. It's easy, and for PR, it's easy for having signatures of exchanging memorandum of understanding to build the pipelines or the train or you name it. The issue is where the money, who will pay the money? The government or the regime itself, they don't have the money. The project that the Russian or Iranian, they hope to do, they need a lot of money for rebuilding the infrastructure in order to start to gain the money. So we are talking about a lot of money in between that does not exist. Turkey, United States, definitely they are doing something very small in the Jazeera region, Raqqa, or in Afrin and other areas. They are doing the basic services, like small streets or building hospitals, but it's not reconstructions. Even the Saudis, when they say we donate $150 million for Raqqa, they did nothing.
Okay.
The money is not spent yet. So in the media, there's a lot of numbers. In reality, there's nothing. So today, the United States and the West, they are telling Russia, mainly to Russians, that if you want the money, you have to change the behavior of the regime. Iran is enemy. Nobody is talking about Iran as a partner or as part of the solution. It is the problem, not part of the problem. Iran is the problem in Syria. It's a problem for Turkey. It's a problem for Iraq. It's a problem for Syrian #1. So I don't see, again, that the kind of investing or reinvest money in Syria is going to anywhere rather than just used as public statement from here and there.
Okay, so let me get a response from Omer. Omer, it's okay, it's easy to sign an MOU, but it's very different to implement that on the ground, is the argument from Bassam. He's right, isn't he?
Yes, it's right. If we think that the Americans should invest in regime-held areas or the Russians in Turkish protected influence areas. So what we see there is actually is, he said there are many talking about numbers, yes, but in order to pressure the Assad regime with funding, with money, the Assad regime has to be the need to invest and rebuild the country. But actually, that's not the case. So the Assad regime is quite happy with having not 1/3 of the population outside of Syria in order to have a more homogeneous Syria. But it's more Russia who wants the money to invest, as Russia wants to show as success in Syria. However, what we see is not some small activities on the ground. We see more than small activities. They are already investing in projects, and I think hospitals and schools and infrastructure building, this is important. But the case here is, how should the costs be shared? Because almost $400 billion is needed, and no one has this money.
And the country is divided, yes. And there's no solution in sight for the moment, even though the war has somewhat calmed. Let me ask you, Matthew Brodsky, because the Europeans are really pushing for something to happen, especially those European nations whose voting populations don't want any more refugees, and they have very populist governments, if you like. The Austrians, the Italians, the Hungarians, they're in Brussels, they're saying, let's sort it out. Poland as well. We'll give money, just sort Syria out. Is the United States perhaps worried that because of this enthusiasm from the Europeans and this rush from the Europeans to have no more refugees and sort it out as quickly as possible, it's going to give the upper hand to the Russians and the Iranians in Syria and Assad on the ground, because those guys just want to wash their hands of it with no refugees?
I'm afraid that's exactly the case. It seems that Europe is taking a bad policy, which is what it had with its immigration, and then doubling down by making another bad policy. The fact is, the United States would like to see reconstruction when the time is right, but in the areas, again, not controlled by Assad and Iran. There's a long list of items that the United States wants to see happen on the ground. And for Europe, the solution seems to always be, when it comes to money, pretty much seems to always be engaging with America's enemies, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal and sanctions there, whether it has to do here with just throw some money at it. I don't think the number of refugees that many Europeans have in mind are going to be returning to Syria in the numbers that they think. But in the meantime, to just force refugees back to sign sham reconciliation agreements with the regime and to go through another terrorization process with the regime is clearly not the answer. Europe needs to think long-term here. And they're suffering from a lot of really poor policy choices collectively and individually for decades right now. And the answer is not, once again, to have another little Band-Aid solution that, again, exacerbates the problem in the very near future. And the United States isn't going to be footing the bill for that. I think we want to make it as toxic as possible for other countries to invest in places that would really help Iran and help Assad.
Serhan Afajan, in everything that we've been discussing so far, we're talking about motions towards peace, motions towards reconstruction, but there hasn't been justice for a lot of people. And for as long as that continues, what can we expect to see in the coming months and years?
From Iran or from Syria in general?
In general.
Okay, I think, first of all, I have to disagree with Mr. Bassam on Iran's role in Syria. Iran is definitely part of the problem, and it's a major part of the problem. But as far as Turkey and Russia are concerned, their positions are concerned, Iran needs to be part of the solution as well. Maybe in a more restricted way, but Iran is going to be at the table. We want it or not, that's another question.
Okay, so let's get Bassam to respond to that. Bassam, we're hearing from Serhan that the Iranians need to be a part of the solution, whether you like it or not.
No, actually, we saw it in Idlib when the Iranians are pushing the regime to attack Idlib. The Russian and Turkey they stand against that. I mean, we saw this in the last 2 days till today, where the Russian Air Force working with the Turkish tanks on the ground in Idlib to protect it from Assad forces and Iran. That was yesterday and Friday yesterday and the last few days. So Iran, it's part of the problem. I think the more we go forward, we will see more polarization between Iran in position from one hand, which is under sanction, under pressure from international community. They want to strengthen their position on Syria more and more, which goes against the Russian interest to be the broker of whatever the end game in Syria in their own perspective. So I don't see Iran except loser in medium and long term, definitely in Syria. Unfortunately, we are the Syrian, we will pay the price. But I will mention something different about the World Bank numbers. World Bank numbers always, they say between $300 to $400 billion. And they mentioned that to bring Syrian economy to the previous 2011, that means the production started. The people who are running the Syrian program at the World Bank are pro-Russian and the regime, unfortunately, and they exaggerate the numbers. The same departments or other department at the World Bank, they estimated rebuilding the cities, only rebuilding the cities, by $30 to $40 billion.
Okay.
So
well,
this is much less.
Okay, that's an interesting claim you made there. Right. It's an interesting claim you made there, and I'd like to get
and that's
yeah. I'd like to get them to respond to that.
That makes things much more tempting for the future. We have more hope for the future that Syria can rebuild much faster without the Assad regime, without this old polarization on Syria, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd love to get somebody from the World Bank to actually address that accusation that they are pro-regime and pro-Russian. One startling statistic.
I will send you the 2 studies.
Okay, cool. And we'll bring you back and we'll get somebody from the World Bank and we'll set it up. Absolutely. No, I'm looking forward to that. One thing that's startling from the World Bank report, by the way, is that as many as 56% of the country's businesses surveyed by the World Bank have either closed or relocated outside of Syria since 2009. And a big question is who's going to go back given the current situation, right? Let me go back then to my question to you, Serhan. As we talk about peace over justice, what does that mean in the coming months and years?
Well, it means, I think, further crisis. The war may be over. It's not over. In the next months, it may be over, might be over, but not the crisis. Because as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, what we understand from Reconstruction, what does that mean? What does that mean to restore justice in the country? Russia has a different vision. Turkey has a different vision. Iran has a different vision. The United States has a totally different vision. So I think what we see in the future of Syria, at least in the coming months and years maybe, is further crisis. Maybe this crisis is going to be not military, but the political crisis.
Yeah. Samuel, humanitarian organizations complaining in recent years that the Assad regime has been channeling aid to loyalists, and they've called on the EU to do something about it. But at the same time, the EU is pledging billions of dollars. That's going to continue, isn't it? The Assad regime gets bolstered, the Russians get bolstered, the Iranians get bolstered.
Yes, I believe that will continue. And it's been noted, even in 2016, that more than 80% of the humanitarian aid that was being diverted to Syria was being diverted into the hands of the government. And some of these are benefiting major businessmen who were close to the Assad regime, like Rami Makhlouf. And there were also some anecdotes, too, that noted that there were 33 projects that were started at that time, and only 6 of them were actually receiving humanitarian aid. This was in 2016. And I highly doubt that the situation has gotten better since then. In fact, it's probably gotten worse. And Russia and Iran are betting this because this is a way for them to ensure that Assad gets access to capital and gets access to revenues that kind of allows them to evade and to skirt the sanctions. So it's very ironic that the Western powers are talking about no prospects of sanctions relief on Syria, and that being a major stumbling block to reconstruction and investment, but are also empowering the very organizations that are helping the Assad regime. And this is part of a broader state-centric bias in humanitarian aid. In 2014, there was a UN resolution that allowed some aid to enter rebel strongholds, but those rebel aid groups ended up reaching militants and not necessarily the people who are most in need. And that's going to continue to be a problem going forward, that Assad monopolizes and launders the aid for his own purposes.
Omer, does Turkey need to be doing more or less right now?
I personally think Turkey needs to do more, but let me answer some things which were said. First of all, money from the EU for the Assad regime will only function for the Assad regime to pay off his clients. So he will only pay off his loyalists. And I highly doubt that the Assad regime has an interest in making Syria safe and just, which they, furthermore, the Assad regime is more interested in building status of his father, Hafez al-Assad, rather than building some housings in Dera, for example, which there were huge demonstrations days ago. Secondly, I personally think that this cost and the investment should be shared in areas of responsibility. So there should be an area of responsibility in which Turkey acts and Turkey works for rebuilding Syria.
But those become political realities after a while,
yes,
don't they?
Yes, but it's already.
And the country becomes divided.
Yeah, let me give an example. Germany was divided as well after the Second World War. Okay, I know every historic example doesn't fit here, but it's now United Nation now, Germany. Secondly, which is also, thirdly actually, which is also very important is the people themselves. We need people to work. We need employees. There was a war. The people weren't educated for years. A third of the population isn't even in Syria. And the only example where people returned back to Syria is the Euphrates areas in northern Aleppo, where 300,000 refugees returned back. In contrast, for example, from Lebanon, almost no one returned back to Damascus, Homs, etc. From Jordan, almost no one returned back. And the United States of America's controlled areas east of the Euphrates, actually there's still a refugee flow from there to Turkey and northern Iraq.
Yes.
So actually we need people, and there's one good solution, and this is to widen areas of responsibility.
Okay, and this is going to be unpopular with a lot of people. And I guess, you know, you're saying there's a blank slate, there's opportunity for job and so on. The counter-argument is if there's no peace, then it's just the warlords and the criminals who might benefit, right? This is the big tussle that everybody has right now. Bassam Barabandi, the $400 billion question here. This is the burden of the superpower, I guess. People are upset when America does too much. They're upset when America does too little. What do you want as a Syrian? America to be more involved or less?
No, I tell you, we as a Syrian all over the world, we are trying to work our own life away from this politics. So the Syrian American here are working with the Congress for Caesar bill, which is, it's become law that prevent any country to work with the regime by US laws. So we are not waiting the others to tell us what the offers they have. The Syrian in Europe, they have so many cases now against Assad regime and his intelligence and army criminals. Syrian in Turkey, they are starting doing their own business life. Syrian in Jordan or Lebanon, they are trying to figure out their future. So we are not, I think the Syrian day to day, they are trying to figure out the way to go forward without waiting the others to tell us what can we do or what cannot we do. We have other point that the UN, it's really naive institution. Yesterday, the head of the UN in charge of Syrian refugees, he went to Homs and he made a YouTube saying, guys, Syrian, please come back to Homs. At the same time, he said that his organization doesn't have access to the people who came back to make sure they are safe. So the UN is playing different game. The Norway
come
Council
back, but we don't have access to you.
NCR. Yeah, we don't have protect, but come please. The Norway today, they just make statement saying that all the countries should give money for the Syrian refugees or Syrian IDPs inside the regime area. But you know what? All this should go through Damascus, and the way you mentioned it, that to the regime loyalists. But you know what? It's good. Let's give them the money. And when we ask them, why don't you send the money to Rukban? And they say because the regime doesn't give the money for them. They does not allow the food to go there.
Right.
So there's a lot of missing policy, international policy on Syria. And it looks like each country has its own agenda that trying to implement in Syria, political one, military one, or bigger project, or smaller project like Iran or the UN, they just want to do something.
Right.
In the meantime, we are counting on Syrian all over. We are working hard every fields to do our own justice by ourselves or our own rights by ourselves.
Okay, deeply depressing. For 8 years, this continues to rage, no end in sight. Gentlemen, I apologize if everybody didn't get as much of an opportunity to talk as they would have liked. The fault is all mine, but it's been really good to get the varying perspectives. Bassam Barabandi, Samuel Ramani, Serhan Afajan, Matthew Brodsky, and Omer Ozkizilcik. I thank you all for joining us here on the News.